Mark Hadley was not the type to be easily frightened. As an urban researcher, he had spent years entering abandoned buildings, forgotten tunnels, and crumbling ruins. But nothing prepared him for what he found under the city that night. It all started with a rumor. A friend of a friend had mentioned an abandoned subway station deep beneath the existing transportation lines, a station that didn't appear on any modern map. Allegedly, it was built in the early 1900s and then hastily closed after a series of unexplained disappearances. No official records of it remain. Mark was intrigued. After all, he had seen his share of hidden places that turned out to be nothing more than technical tunnels. But this was different. The way people talked about him, the way their voices dropped to whispers, gave him goosebumps. It took him weeks to find a possible entrance. The bricked-up part of the abandoned service tunnel led straight down, the bricks crumbling with time. That night, armed with a flashlight, camera, and crowbar, he made his way inside. The air was thick, musty, and smelled of rust and something slightly rotten. His boots crunched on the dust and debris as he descended. The tunnel twisted and turned unnaturally, curving in ways that made no architectural sense. Then he saw it. A platform engulfed in darkness, covered in dirt and graffiti that shouldn't exist in a place forgotten for decades. The station sign, barely visible under years of decay, read Blackwell Station in peeling paint. The name gave him a strange shiver. He had researched every station ever built in the city, but there had never been a Blackwell Station. A strange noise echoed in the tunnel, distant, like a whisper, carrying through the vast space. He shone his flashlight toward the tracks, expecting to see rats or puddles of water. Instead, he saw footprints. Fresh tracks. They led away from him, disappearing into the shadows of the tunnel behind the platform. Something was down here with him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The tracks were not old. The edges were crisp, untouched by dust. Someone or something had walked this path very recently. His flashlight flickered, just for a second, and in that moment he thought he saw movement at the far end of the platform. A shadow moving just beyond the reach of the beam. He swallowed hard to keep the flashlight in his hand. "Hello?" His voice echoed unnaturally, stretching out longer than it should have. Silence. Mark forced himself forward, stepping onto the platform. The tiles beneath his boots were cracked and uneven, some areas completely missing, revealing a dark void below. He had explored many old tunnels, but this place seemed wrong. The air was thick, not only with dust but also with something else, a presence. He followed the footprints. They led past an old wooden bench, past a rusty sign warning of trespassing fines, as if anyone here had ever enforced them, and straight into the gaping tunnel ahead. The beam of his flashlight stretched out in the darkness, illuminating the damp walls covered with faded advertisements. Advertisements for long-dead brands, their models staring blankly, their eyes faded to spots. The sound, a shuffling sound, wet and deliberate. Mark stopped. The sound came from inside the tunnel. His pulse quickened. He had walked through tunnels before. The rats, the dripping water, the moving debris. He knew the sounds. This one was different. It was heavier, more purposeful. He lifted his camera and took a picture deep into the tunnel, the flash cutting through the blackness for just a moment. And then he saw her. A shape, not fully formed, not quite human, but it stood there, hunched over, watching. Then the flashlight went out. Everything went black, and something was breathing right next to his ear. Mark's flashlight trembled in his hand, a faint beam cutting through the humid air. He froze, staring into the dark tunnel where he had seen the figure a moment before. But now there was nothing. The air around him had changed. It became heavier, thicker, as if the tunnel itself was pressing down on him. A deep, suffocating silence enveloped him, watching, waiting. A whisper crept through the silence. Faint, distant, but it was not an echo, it was a voice. Low, distorted, as if someone was speaking underwater. Mark swallowed hard. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get out of this place. But he had spent years exploring abandoned places. He had learned that fear was a lie, that most places only seemed haunted because of the mind's tendency to fill in the unknown. But this place was different. Slowly, he lifted the camera. His fingers trembled as he clicked the camera into the depths of the tunnel. The flash exploded against the darkness, only for a split second, and then his stomach turned to ice. Something was there, not far ahead, at the edge of the light. A figure, not quite a person, not quite something. The figure was hunched over, its limbs too long, its fingers curled on the rails as if it were preparing to move. The face, if it had one, was obscured, but Mark could make out the faint outline of a gaping mouth, open and too wide. His breath caught in his throat. The camera screen flickered, distorting the image for a moment before resetting. The figure disappeared. Mark's fingers gripped the camera, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He turned slowly, scanning the tunnel with his flashlight, but the darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. Then another sound, a grinding sound, quiet at first, then louder. A metallic scraping coming from somewhere around a bend in the tunnel. Mark stepped back, his boots crunching on the dirty tiles of the platform. He had explored hundreds of abandoned places, but this was something else. A chill ran down his spine. He turned around sharply, snapping another photo toward the platform, just to ground himself, to remind himself where he was. The camera flashed. An image appeared, and Mark held his breath. The station sign had changed. It no longer read Blackwell Station. Now, in uneven, rusty letters, it read, "Leave." Mark's fingers tightened. No, this couldn't be right. He had just seen the original sign. His mind was playing a trick on him. He turned back to the tunnel, forcing himself to think rationally. Maybe the old station was being renovated. Maybe someone had changed the signs as a joke. Maybe. He heard the whispering again. Louder. Closer this time. Mark turned around sharply, the beam of his flashlight shaking. The tunnel ahead seemed wrong, as if space itself had stretched, turning into something that shouldn't have existed. Then the smell hit him. Rot. Not just dust and damp air, but the stench of something old, something dead. His fingers clutched the flashlight. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped into the tunnel. The walls were different. They were no longer the modern walls of the subway. They were brick, old and fragile, covered with dark spots. The advertisements on the walls were irregular, faded, with strange, hollow-eyed figures wearing clothes from another century. He clicked another photo. A flash. The image loaded. Mark's stomach twisted. There were people in the tunnel now. Figures standing against the walls, their backs turned away from him. Dozens of them. Still. Silent. He hadn't seen them before. They hadn't been here before. His throat tightened. He lifted the flashlight, forcing himself to look. The tunnel was empty, but he could feel them. Something touched his arm. It was cold. Mark spun around, his heart pounding, but there was nothing but shadows. His breathing was sharp, uneven, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body did not move. The whispers grew, merging into a single, distorted voice. "You don't belong here." The flashlight blinked, and for the briefest, most terrifying moment, Mark saw something around the bend in the tunnel. A door. An old one. Rusty. Open. And something came out of the darkness behind it. The last thing Mark saw before the flashlight went out was an arm wrapped around the doorframe. A long arm. Unnatural. Moving towards him. And then, darkness. Something was breathing in his ear. Nothing. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. Footsteps slow, cautious echoed in the tunnel, approaching. His instincts told him to run, but his feet clung to the muddy platform. Each breath seemed thick and heavy, as if the air itself was resisting him. And then he heard a sound. A metallic scraping sound, like rusty railroad wheels grinding on ancient tracks. But it was impossible. There were no active lines. Mark turned to the edge of the platform, peering into the black tunnel where the tracks stretched into nowhere. His flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, but something was changing. A glow. A sickly, flickering yellow light was coming from the depths of the tunnel. It was not uniform. It pulsed like an old reel of film caught in a projector. It took his breath away. It was a train, or at least it looked like a train. As it rumbled closer, Mark could make out its features: an old subway car, its metal body bent and rusted, its windows fogged and smeared with something dark. The car creaked to a halt on the platform, and the doors opened with a groan. Inside, the car was dimly lit by flickering bulbs that cast long, curved shadows on the empty seats. Only they were not empty. Figures sat motionless on the seats with their backs turned to him. Their clothes were shabby, stiff with age and dirt. Some wore suits from another era, others wore worn coats, and their heads were tilted at unnatural angles. Mark had a disgusting realization. They were not passengers. They were the bars. A soft click sounded behind him. He turned around sharply. The camera hanging around his neck had taken a picture of itself. The digital screen flickered as it processed the image, and then his stomach cramped. The picture was of a train, just like the one he was in now, but there were faces looking at him through the windows. Not bodies that had fallen, not passengers. Faces. Dozens of faces. Eyes bulging, mouths wide open, their skin sagging like wax pressed against the glass. Watching him, Mark took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run. The train let out a long, empty sigh of air. The doors stood open, waiting, and then a hand grabbed his wrist. Cold. Sticky. Mark's scream choked in his throat as he yanked the hand back. His flashlight turned sharply, revealing. His skin crawled where he felt the grip. He breathed short, frantic breaths. He had to get out. He had to get out now. Turning around, he ran for the stairwell, the same one he had entered through. His boots pounded on the tiled floor. His breath was short and his chest burned. But something was wrong. The stairs, they were no longer there. The platform stretched endlessly. No exit, no doors. Only a tunnel, a train and tracks. Trapped. A faint whisper seeped through the air, swirling around him like smoke. Next stop? Mark's flashlight flickered again. Boarding. A shadow moved inside the train. Something was awake. Mark's mind raced. His pulse pounded like a drumbeat in his skull. The platform stretched too far, for an incredibly long time, warping and distorting the reality he had known only moments before. The stairs disappeared. The tunnel was a living whisper. And the train. Something inside was moving. His flashlight blinked frantically, the beams splashing back and forth, barely illuminating the rusty metal of the subway car. His breathing was ragged as he took a cautious step back. The shadow inside the train had grown. A figure, tall and unnatural, unfolded from one of the fallen bodies. It moved stiffly, as if it had not been standing for years. The overhead lights of the train barely illuminated it, but Mark could see its contours, jagged, hunched, with arms that stretched a little too long. The monstrosity turned its head toward him. It had no face, only smooth, waxy skin where the features should have been. Mark's stomach twisted. He tried to step back, but the moment his foot touched the tiled floor, a terrible realization hit him. His boots made no sound. The whispers around him grew louder and louder. Get on the train. Take your seat. Your stop is coming up. Mark shook his head furiously. No, I'm not supposed to be here. His voice sounded wrong, distorted, in the thick, suffocating air. The faceless figure inside the train took a step forward, its movements jerky, like a puppet on broken strings. Its head twitched as if it was listening. Then there was another sound. Behind him. Footsteps. Not his. Slow, shuffling, getting closer. Mark turned around, the flashlight beam shaking wildly. And then his breath caught in his throat. The platform was no longer empty. They stood in rows, figures dressed in ancient clothing, their suits and dresses eaten away by time. Hollow-eyed, with slack jaws, their skin gray and stretched too thin. There are dozens of them. Some are still clutching briefcases. Others, hands folded in their laps, are waiting, patiently waiting. Passengers. Their heads turned to him in unison. Mark stepped back, his flashlight shaking. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the air smelled rotten. Old metal and damp cloth. Bodies left to decompose. A guttural sound came from the throat of one of the passengers. Then another. A low, horrifying chorus of inhuman voices rising in unison. Get on the train. Mark's skin shivered. His instincts screamed at him to run. But where? The stairs disappeared. The tunnel stretched in darkness. A faceless conductor stepped off the train. His body convulsed as he moved, his fingers long, too thin twitching. Mark clenched his jaw. No, he would not let this place consume him. Think. Find a way out. The beam of his flashlight darted frantically across the platform. There had to be an emergency exit somewhere, a service hatch, a maintenance door. And he saw it. Near the far end of the platform, almost hidden by decades of dirt and rust, was a ladder. A metal ladder leading up. His way out. He pulled himself up. As soon as he moved, they screamed. The passengers leaned forward. The faceless conductor let out a guttural, metallic scream. Mark ran. The platform bent unnaturally beneath him, but he pushed forward, fighting the suffocating wrongness of this place. The stairs were just ahead, so close. A cold hand grabbed his wrist. Mark let out a strangled cry. He pulled his hand away, feeling the frozen, dead fingers digging into his skin. He didn't look back, he couldn't. His hands gripped the metal railing. Get up, get up, get up. The whisper turned into a howl, a symphony of crying voices. You don't belong here. You weren't supposed to see us. You can't leave. Cold fingers touched his ankle. He kicked with his foot, freeing the gripping hand, and climbed faster. His muscles screamed. His breathing was ragged, but he kept moving. Then he saw the hatch. A rusty, corroded metal door above him. Mark pressed his shoulder against them and pushed. They did not give way. No, no, no. He punched them in desperation. The whispering beneath him grew into a piercing, ear-splitting scream. The conductor was climbing the ladder. Mark rushed to the hatch one last time, and it gave way. He fell out, gasping for breath, and rolled on the hard concrete. The air suddenly became fresh and cold, biting his sweat-soaked skin. He found himself in a maintenance corridor. An ordinary corridor. He turned sharply, shining the flashlight back into the opening. There was no subway platform, just empty, black nothingness. The whispering stopped. The only sound now was his own ragged breathing. Mark sat shivering, his hands still clutching the flashlight. Then, with a slow, sickening fear, he turned his wrist to look at his watch. It was still running. It was still ticking. But the time was wrong. He had been down there for 6 hours, and it seemed to him that he had only been down there for 30 minutes. He felt ants running through him. Whatever this place was, it didn't follow the same rules as reality. Mark didn't stop running until he reached the surface. He never turned back, and no one else did either, because a week later, when he checked the old service tunnel, the entrance was bricked up again, as if it had never existed, as if it had been waiting for him.